Agreement agenda item 6 recorded by Hansard. Agreed. Apologies from the Vice Chair and Michaela Boyle will be slightly late. Any other apologies? No. Refer members draft minutes pages 5 to 9 that PAX members content accurate regular proceedings.
Agreed.
Table request for information. Pages 11 to 12 of your PAX for noting. Moving on to the first presentation, measuring wellbeing from the Carnegie Trust. I refer members to the following documents: letter from Carnegie Trust to the committee, which is at pages 14 to 20 of your PAX, and the report on measuring wellbeing in NA, pages 21 to 56 of your PAX. So we'll move straight into the presentation then. Okay, members, can I welcome to the meeting John Woods, Carnegie Associate, School of Law, Martin Evans, who's Chief Executive of Carnegie UK Trust, and Dr. Peter Doran, Carnegie Associate, School of Law as well. Do you want to perhaps just give us a brief opening address to start, perhaps outlining the background to the report and the importance of measuring wellbeing and the relevance of the report findings to the remit of the Department of Finance and Personnel?
I will, and good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation, Mr. Mackay, and fellow members of the committee. I'm going to give a very short overview presentation, and Peter is going to give a more equally short detail about the roundtable we are proposing. So, as Mr. Mackay said, I'm Chief Executive for the Carnegie UK Trust, founded by Andrew Carnegie in 1913. In 2008, President Sarkozy of France set up a commission led by Joseph Stiglitz to advise how better to measure economic performance and social progress. And a year later, they reported, and they recommended this. At the national level, roundtables should be established with the involvement of stakeholders to identify and prioritise those indicators that carry the potential for a shared view of how social progress is happening and how it can be sustained over time. Our trust then established a round table on measuring what matters in Scotland in 2008 following that recommendation, and we've been working in other parts of the UK and the Republic of Ireland. Our Scottish round table is widely drawn from civil society, academia, the media and senior civil service, and it sought to identify and prioritise indicators on social progress as recommended by the Stiglitz Commission. And the influential report, More Than GDP, Measuring What Matters, made a number of recommendations. We then decided to undertake some research work on an international basis, visiting various jurisdictions that appeared to be further ahead than the UK in terms of using wellbeing data to inform policy change. And my staff visited government initiatives in the state of Virginia, France, the city of Guelph, city of Somerville, and civil society initiatives in Canada, the Canadian Index on Wellbeing and Vital Signs. And we published our research, Shifting the Dial, and concluded, to both our surprise and our delight, that Scotland had created a world-leading approach in wellbeing. And I say to our surprise because in Scotland we don't tend to think that we're going to find excellence on our doorstep, and our delight because we did. That view was later shared by Professor Stiglitz in an address to the OECD in India. We produced from that a report, Shifting the Dial in Scotland, to focus on next steps. And the Cabinet Secretary, John Swinney, invited us to join him in a ministerial group to consolidate the National Performance Framework. Our Trust's latest discussion paper on this issue, Measuring Wellbeing in Northern Ireland, A New Conversation for New Times, reports on the outcome of a conference we hosted in the autumn of 2013 in Belfast on measuring economic performance and societal change in Northern Ireland. And I'm delighted to note that your chair, Mr. Mackay, delivered a very supportive address at our event. The report was written by Peter Doran and John Woods at Queen's University Belfast, and our head of policy, Jennifer Wallace. The conference explored how the concept of wellbeing can be used to promote this social change. In Northern Ireland, delegates thought this work was of special urgency. A key emerging theme from the conference was that a Northern Ireland government focus on wellbeing in terms of gauging the outcomes would help legislators construct a shared narrative, and the strapline sums up the hope for the future, a new conversation for new times. We agreed to support a roundtable here, and it will include a range of representatives from the civil service, business, the third sector and academia, and John and Peter will act as the Carnegie Associates delivering the secretariat to that group. I'm going to ask Peter to say a little bit more about the roundtable.
Thanks, Martin. Okay, as Martin has indicated, the School of Law at Queen's has been working in partnership with the Carnegie Trust to establish the roundtable on measuring well-being. And I'm pleased to inform you that the roundtable will gather a wealth of experience from across our senior civil service, local government, civil society, economics and academia. The first of 4 meetings will convene on the 24th of this month, and we'll conduct a study trip to Scotland that will be hosted jointly by the Trust and the Scottish Government. This morning I'd like to do 2 things. I'd like to give you a flavour of some of the discussions that I anticipate will be taken up at the roundtable following on from our report, Measuring Wellbeing in Northern Ireland. And secondly, I'd like to provide a bit of detail on the Scottish Government's performance framework. In Scotland, the performance framework has begun to be integrated into systems of scrutiny and into the budgetary cycle. So Scotland's Finance Committee has been to the fore in this process of using the Scotland Performance Framework with its indicators as part of its duties to the Parliament. So let me begin. The roundtable will be an opportunity to build on NISRA's work, which is based on the UK Office of National Statistics Measuring National Wellbeing Programme. And you'll hear more about that programme from Kevin Sweeney from NISRA, who will follow in the next presentation. The roundtable will consider what well-being means for us in this part of the country, given our own recent history and specific challenges on several fronts, be they societal, economic or environmental. Consider, for example, how we might recast our vision of a united community around notions of well-being. In other words, what price in terms of well-being do we pay for continuing division and antagonism across our communities? Or to put it another way, going further, we might consider how an enhanced sense of well-being in our communities might contribute to the confidence and stability required to build a more inclusive, equal and settled society where we are more at ease in ourselves and with each other. Have we begun to consider, for example, the qualities of mind and outlook that might best support the emergence of a confident citizenry and a new public sphere for open-ended and transformative conversations? The unavoidable legacy issues with which Ambassador Haas and the executive parties have struggled recently have profound implications for dimensions of well-being. They provide the defining prism here in Northern Ireland through which we must examine the most generic issues such as mental health, education, civic participation, public space and personal security. Well-being, if you like, is both a means and an end in the context of our process of enabling flourishing and united communities, a process that will demand the cultivation of skills and capabilities supportive of political cultures that are more accommodating of deep listening, empathy and a creative openness to a genuinely co-authored future. A few words now on the Scotland Performance Framework. At the start of the 3rd session of the Scottish Parliament, as part of the 2007 spending review, the Scottish Government introduced a new outcomes-based national performance framework to underpin the delivery of its agenda. In June 2008, the Government launched Scotland Performs, a website designed to present information at a glance on how Scotland is performing against a range of indicators and targets outlined in the performance framework. The framework has 5 levels, and I've some copies of the framework outline here if you'd like to take a quick look. It just helps to locate the purpose of the indicators if you take a look. So the framework has 5 levels. The level of the overall purpose, which sets out the direction and ambition for Scotland, which you might call the overarching narrative of the Scottish Government. There are 11 purpose targets, high-level targets that show progress towards the purpose, 5 strategic objectives, 16 national outcomes, and 50 national indicators. The Carnegie Trust has recognised this framework as a world-leading model, one that embeds a clear purpose, centred on the well-being of citizens and communities, built on sustained economic growth at the heart of the governmental process. What's most interesting about this robust performance framework that puts a coherent narrative at the heart of the social contract between the Scottish Government and its citizens, and between the national government and local government, is the emerging impact on policy design and the budgetary process. What will be of particular interest to you as members of the Finance and Personnel Committee will be the way in which the Scotland Performs framework has begun to support the scrutiny function, including, for example, the draft budget or consideration of the draft budget 2014 to 15. The Finance Committee's consideration of the draft budget and the Government's performance and outcomes as part of the Parliament's strategic budget phase in Scotland is now facilitated by the Scotland Performs framework. Each of the subject committees across the Scottish Parliament now reports to the Finance Committee on performance against the indicators that underpins the Scotland Performs framework. So it's within this wider performance framework in Scotland, Scotland Performs, that indicators and new measures of social progress come into their own. The Scotland Performs framework, with its levels of indicators and top-level purpose, to focus government and public services on creating a more successful country, has already gone some way to embedding a coherent, people-centred narrative across the government apparatus. Scotland took some of its learning from the Commonwealth of Virginia in the United States, and I'm hopeful that our roundtable will also bring lessons home that will make a valuable contribution to the wellbeing conversation here in Northern Ireland. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I have to say, first of all, I mean, obviously, I did attend the conference late last year, and it is a fascinating area. I suppose one of the challenges is generating public awareness and public understanding, and even understanding amongst members of the Assembly in terms of what well-being is, how it can benefit the local population in terms of how government keeps a measurement of it and account of how we are progressing. But in terms of Scotland and the Scottish experience, I mean, obviously there's always the comparison between GDP growth for the sake of growth, perhaps, and well-being as being a more holistic approach to measuring how a country or a region is doing. In Scotland, what kind of public awareness is there or has there been about the well-being debate? I mean, in terms of the measurement of well-being, is it something that's in the public discourse, or has it perhaps been sidelined perhaps by the Scottish independence debate, because a lot of it is focused on GDP and growth and how Scotland would do if it was independent?
Thank you. The truth is, since this was started in 2007 by a minority SNP government that had no experience of being in government in its political life, it was a mechanism that they started to use internally to hold to account performance within departments. And I think we've all been on a journey since 2007 to get a greater understanding of how this can be useful more widely. So the truth is, it's taking quite a long time to embed itself within the internal political processes, the scrutiny processes within the Scottish Parliament, and it is still taking quite some time to be part of a public conversation at civil society level. And part of our evidence of that was, which is from our international evidence, it didn't start off as a public conversation about what the ambitions of that society were, because it started off from a particular need from the 2007 government. And where this has been successful in a wider conversation, which I think you're getting at, it's where it started off with a much more engagement, public engagement. John Swinney in Scotland has now agreed to have a public engagement process to try to talk more about ambitions of a society, what the outcomes might be, and embed this wider. The second point is that really the subtitle of everything I would say about this is GDP plus. This is not a substitute for GDP. It is not instead of GDP. It's GDP is critical. It's a long-standing number. this is getting it beyond. And the 2008 crash, of course, really refocused people on GDP as a mark of social progress. The interesting thing about that debate, people understand GDP, they say it's GDP plus because growth of GDP has been distanced, has been disaggregated from growth in real incomes. So in the past, you had a kind of rough alignment between GDP growing and real incomes growing. In the last 10 years, there's been a disaggregation. GDP has grown, but real incomes, median incomes, have not grown. In fact, they've changed. That doesn't mean to say we undermine GDP. It's a long fought for single number, but it does actually measure busyness of an economy. So that's a long answer to your question. The short answer is, in media terms, the GDP is the key figure. In scrutiny terms, there's a whole range of scrutiny mechanisms. This is not the central mechanism, but in terms of the journey, we're very much more to having this dashboard that we've circulated. And the key issue is the question of why. If the dashboard is indicating down or up, the question is why is that happening and what can be done about that. So I'm optimistic that this is the right path to be on, but it's not a quick place to be.
Some of the things that are typically measured, a number of the case studies that you alluded to, in terms of health, in terms of environment, etc. One could put the argument that if you look at our programme for government, there's already a measurement for those sorts of areas there already. So how would you counter that argument that we are already measuring well-being within the programme for government?
Well, I'll just say a quick thing. Of course, you're measuring a whole range of issues on well-being. The challenge, and I think that's absolutely right, the challenge is to put those in to something which is a shared narrative, which is where people would like to be. That's the ambition for the future. And to actually hold to account when things are not going so well or the measurements are not changing. So nobody's saying this is a blank sheet of paper at all. This is just a contribution to actually move forward, something which has momentum here already.
Yeah, and to go back to your initial point as well, one of the advantages of the framework is the transparency that the accountability takes on whenever the dashboard is published and is updated on a regular basis. And these are not simple indicators that are linked to specific policy outcomes. They're high-level indicators. I'll just give you some examples. You begin with the government's overarching purpose, and then there are high-level targets relating to the purpose, the direction of travel of the overall government. So it's areas of like productivity, participation, solidarity, cohesion. And then you get down into the strategic objectives and national outcomes. So it's a clever, integrated collection of indicators and statements which give the citizens a clear sense of the direction of travel, and it's a coherent narrative, an integrated collection of outcomes, and you can see very quickly on the dashboard whether the government is delivering. So in a sense, those of you who are charged with scrutiny, you are then accompanied by a much wider grouping within civil society who can also see where government is delivering and where the shortcomings are. And there's a continual engagement. The Finance Committee in Scotland at the moment are conducting a consultation on the current Scotland Performs indicators to invite civil society and the public to identify gaps to improve the scrutiny process. So it widens the conversation, if you like, within the population, and enhances the relationship between civil society and the government.
Well, perhaps just briefly on that, as well as in the programme for government, the targets and so on are set on a pretty much departmental basis. If you're focusing on outcomes, it's cut across government, and you'll get a more sort of holistic and complete response as a result of focusing on those outcomes.
In terms of, obviously there's been conversations in regard to this for the best part of a year or more now. in regard to how we move forward in the area of well-being. And Scotland is the example that's been flagged up here today. Is Scotland the model we should be looking towards, or is there benefits to aspects of some of the Nordic countries' approach to well-being, or even North American example?
From the results of our research, I would say Scotland, you should look to Scotland, yes, because it has a range, it is drawn from other jurisdictions. Scotland is good on objective well-being. It sets out benchmarks for that. Others are better on subjective well-being, how people feel. It has some indicators on that, but it's much more active in terms of a government's intervention in well-being. So we would say look to Scotland, but of course I wouldn't say just look just to Scotland, because when you go to Scotland, I hope some of you are able to go to Scotland, they'll tell you what they've learned from other jurisdictions as well. Our evidence is it's the best around the world that we have looked at in terms of a government focus on well-being. There are others, like the Oxfam's Humankind Index, which is a civil society measure about how people feel, which I don't think would be suitable for a government, but it's complementary, it's not a rival at all. And I don't say that because we work in Scotland, although we cover the United Kingdom and Ireland. I say that because the evidence is it is a thoughtful programme which is challenging. It is transparent, as Peter has said. It holds the government to account. Most importantly, and in Canada, they say it raises a question of why. It doesn't raise the question of who's to blame. It says, well, if an indicator is looking up or down, it raises the question of why. Why is that happening? And it focuses on preventative measures. It's one of the key aspects of, we think, a 21st century government to get ahead of the game and invest in preventative measures rather than reactive measures too. So it drives what John was saying. It drives government departments to be working together, which is ambition for most modern governments, and it drives investment into the future preventative spend to reduce costs into the future. So for those reasons, I'd be reluctant to say only look at Scotland, but I would say it's not a bad place to start, frankly.
Yeah, the Scottish Finance Committee has estimated that about 40% of the budget is going at the moment in Scotland towards addressing issues that could have been prevented had there been a preventative or early intervention approach. So there's a very interesting possibility around this.
Just on that point, Peter, is that mainly health?
That would be health and also involvement in the criminal justice system as well. So there are interesting possibilities around identifying opportunities to achieve efficiencies that are financial, of course, ultimately, but also efficiencies in terms of addressing where problems begin in people's lives, where the challenges lie, and intervening much more coherently and when it counts. Can I just say that it's useful to think of this as well, not just in terms of indicators and measures, but as a feedback loop that has implications for the policy design process and the way we do policy. And John, of course, has mentioned that we're talking about more joined up collaboration across departments, for example. And it's in that sense that I would be keen to look beyond Scotland as well, because I think that's where some of the Nordic countries have lessons to offer in terms of their approach to governance.
Briefly, that at the conference back in September, when Sir John Elvidge spoke, he is the former Permanent Secretary of the Scottish Government. He told us how he was engaged with a number of people in Nordic countries, discussing some of these issues and sharing the things they were experiencing, and that there was scope for Northern Ireland to be involved in that conversation as well. So perhaps we should at some point take advantage of that.
Okay, Peter.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I mean, looking at sort of the objectives that are set, I mean, to what extent is there objective sort of international comparators, and to what extent is it within the hands of government to set the objection to the targets? You can appreciate, obviously, we're at the start of a process, and obviously, gentlemen, you know a lot more about the Scottish example, but just looking in terms of the handout that we've been given on the purpose and associated targets, I can see if I was sitting there in government, the Scottish Government, how some of those are quite clearly very objective things which, from that point of view, it is very difficult to, for want of a better word, fiddle the figures. There's a few others, and governments across the world are notorious for this, that they will quite often be keen to set objectives which, in such a way then that they know that they're going to meet. And there's a number of those there, which quite frankly I would regard as relatively easy to meet. Even if there's very, very little progress, it's ticking a particular box. I mean, to what extent is there independence in terms of setting objectives, and to what extent is there something by way of a broader international comparators that can be used for the thing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. To be absolutely frank, the benefit of the Scottish system is that it is set by the government. These are what the government says the outcomes should be if judged to be successful. The weakness is that it never consulted on those in 2007 because of the circumstances, and that's what we identify as a weakness. It never got a broad consensus about that. So
you think buy-in is quite an important sort of...
Buy-in's critical, because without buy-in, you're not going to get support for it. But I can understand why they weren't able to do this in 2007 and why they're trying to do it now. But the thing about buy-in is you can't always get the consensus at the time. And I'm just distinguishing the Scottish Government approach to objective well-being is a definitely policy-led, government-led process. It will try to be as inclusive as possible if it's to be excellent. Subjective well-being, which is what the UK government is trying to do in England through the ONS, is look at a range of domains of well-being, how people feel about themselves. That's how people themselves determine whether or not they're okay, and you can measure that too. We are suggesting we're going to look at both in the round table. What we're suggesting the starting point is this objective, policy-led well-being. It, of course, suffers from the weaknesses that you suggest in a bad policy-making will not be made good policy-making by going through this process. I think the key for us is to be quite inclusive in setting it up. And as I said, the weakness, again, from our evidence was the Scottish Government rushing, quite rightly, to be a minority government for the first time had to have some mechanism to bring together what they saw as a weakness in government, which was the departmental silo and the lack of focus beyond GDP. This is what they arrived at, and I think it actually is pretty good. But it is government policy-led.
And I suppose part of that as well is it also went to, in terms of Scotland, the way they did things, which may also be maybe the other part of the coin was that they looked in terms of trying to break down silos by radically reforming their government in terms of departments to have a much more reduced number of departments. Now, a lot of sort of a strong view that there should be a lot fewer government departments in Northern Ireland. We should see in sort of a slimming down of that. There are other political reasons why maybe we're not in a position to go as far as Scotland, but it was part of a wider picture in that regard, and I suppose it fit in. Can I ask you just one other issue I want to touch on? One of the things that slightly worries me, I look at this, I look at the national figures. Looking at the handout we've got, we talk about, and I presume this is the national performance. By the way, sorry, in terms of that, is that the national one rather than the Scottish one, or is that the handout?
No, that's the Scottish one.
Okay, sorry, yes, ambitious
performance.
Okay. So we're talking about 11 purpose targets, 5 strategic objectives, 16 objectives, national outcomes, 50 national indicators. We look, I think, at the wider UK one. It talks about 10 domains, 41 indicators. Now, two problems immediately strike me with that. One level of criticism has been because, in terms of from a target perspective, and there's been criticism, to be fair, it's been less in terms of the Northern Ireland situation, but across in England, one of the criticisms there, in particularly issues around health and education, has been there has been such a plethora of targets, indicators that have been there, that there is a tendency for people to, sort of fail to see the wood for the trees situation. Secondly, it has been such a scattergun approach of chasing after targets that has lost perspective on what needs to be actually properly delivered. The other criticism that potentially is made with where you have quite a sort of a target-based approach is that it becomes, particularly large numbers of targets, it becomes almost a bit of a tick box exercise as to how can we fit the circumstances so we can tick the box. So to take, I suppose, an example or two, if you take something like planning, if you have, here's a target time by which a planning application has to be dealt with, well actually, let's front load this in fairly open-ended long discussions on the pre-application side of it, so that by the time you get to the actual point which it counts by way of trigger to start in, you've spent so long before that point that actually it's relatively easy to meet a target beyond that. Or, for example, as has happened in various jurisdictions, there at times have been issues around waiting lists for hospitals. They again were across the water, where it's then been a question of the clock only starts, you know, a target has been given, and the way that that is then got round is the clock has only started whenever a particular referral takes place, or indeed, you know, people are put on a waiting list before they get onto a waiting list. And so effectively, to some extent, now those are quite clearly very deliberate efforts to try and fiddle the figures. Concern would be if you have a large number, particularly if you have a very indicator-driven bid, people simply try and, where possible, ensure what they can to tick the box, rather than creating genuine improvement for people. And indeed, particularly if there's a feeling that the heat is on a particular department with, you know, our department is really has a degree of responsibility for 7 of these indicators, well, let's at least make sure that we get over the line in our particular ones, irrespective of whether that really is commensurate with proper change for people.
I think at the heart of this is that approach you're taking. You're talking about this new public management approach to targets has been thrown out in Scotland, but some of the language remains in here. So there is the potential for confusion by using the word target to say there's 2 different types of target. The new public management, which is like what was there, target-driven, all the weaknesses that you're talking about, gaming, manipulation, in there.
But having said that, irrespective of whether the direct language is there, if you have a series of indicators, and any government that is setting something of this nature up, will essentially looking to judge its own record on how, indeed, publicly it is going to be. And it does keep governments a little bit on their toes, but essentially they're looking at the basis of, well, are we meeting our indicators? Are we going to get public criticism if we have 50 indicators, they may not be targets, but indicators, as to whether we're achieving progress? Are we going to get criticism or praise, depending on how many of them those meet? Those become de facto targets, irrespective of what the wording around that is, and there would be a big pressure on government to deliver according to particular standards, but those may be simply tailoring what they're doing to meet the standards rather than necessarily improving things to the same extent.
Again, to be frank, the purpose of the National Performance Framework is to set the indicators so if they're not being met, there's a conversation about why not and what intervention and who should intervene to actually make sure that they are met. If they were targets which the government had direct control over, what you say would happen, they would be able to intervene or not. Quite often they're not, the government doesn't have direct control over the relative merits or relative abilities of Scotland's GDP to grow or lessen, or inequalities to grow in the economy. So that's the first point. The second point is should be, and there is a public conversation about the appropriateness of the targets, you know, of the indicators, which you'll hear from your National Statistics Office, our own National Statistics Office in the UK government and the Scottish government and the Welsh government are deeply involved in saying what are the appropriate indicators you can get for measuring progress. And I think what you're saying is at the heart of this discussion. How can we make it so it's not just a target, an old-style target measure system? Because I think it would be of little interest to you in a scrutiny committee and not much value to the wider society. So the ambition is much more than you saying it's used in a quite different way.
Is it though, as part of that, I mean, maybe this is a good thing in and of itself, but is it something which will require a much more mature public discourse if this is to be successful? And what I mean by that is, you can switch on the radio, and whether it's, I suppose, particularly except Nolan, Talkback, or any of these things on a day-to-day basis. And an awful lot of the conversation, whatever political representative is on, public representative on, it will frequently get fired a lot of stuff, which with the best will in the world, if you're talking about, for instance, the GDP side of it, which is not necessarily within completely the control of the government, there seems to be quite a particularly media discourse, maybe a public discourse, which quite often will be more than happy to blame the government, blame the executive, blame the assembly or whatever on failure to meet things which are largely outside of the control of the executive. And I think if you're going to have that level of focusing at how we improve various indicators, how we improve well-being, then alongside that, I think that's only going to work if you have a raising of the standard in terms of the public discourse side of it. And I fear very much that what the danger on the thing is, it then very quickly becomes, and the pressure comes within departments, of an exercise in saying, there are 50 indicators, to be perfectly honest on it, we don't want to get massacred, we're only meeting 20 out of the 50 as opposed to 40 out of the 50. And it may well be that a lot of those indicators are things which we're trying to influence rather than thing, but that doesn't seem, in terms of where we are in terms of public debate in Northern Ireland at times, to be in that particular.
Yeah. No, I think you're correct. But I think it'd be ironic if this was to lead to just a repetition of some of those unhelpful engagements that you're talking about, because as Martin has already indicated, this movement, the wellbeing movement, is actually an attempt to shift away from that new public management obsession with inputs and outputs. We're often measuring process rather than outcomes. And the key shift here, if you see, is the shift toward the language of national outcomes. So that you're also beginning to move away from some of the narrow process indicators and provide a picture of whether or not you're moving in the longer term towards qualitative outcomes around longer, healthier lives, tackling significant inequalities, living in well-designed, sustainable places. I think that's the key corrective here when it comes to the risks that you're talking about. Can I also just go back to your first question? There are in terms of comparability, it's, if you look at the high-level purpose targets, there's a number of them that do refer to comparability. For example, matching GDP growth rates with small independent EU countries in terms of productivity, ranking in the top quartile for productivity against our key trading partners in the OECD. So there is some comparability built into the suite of measures in the Scottish approach. But the 2 points I would say is that, I think we have an opportunity to learn from any risks that are built into the Scottish system. And I think you're quite right that we need to be cautious of that. But in fact, the overall movement is away from that new public management obsession. So we should take some comfort from that's part of the learning embedded in this process.
Okay, thank you.
Rachel?
Yeah. Good morning. Very interesting concept here. One I find quite stimulating. Thinking about I suppose the practicalities, we have to reflect on recent conversations that we've had and just how hard it is to have a focused or unified vision. There are so many, I suppose, unresolved issues which may uniquely characterise this region. I'm interested in terms of the, how the concept was actually bought onto. And set aside just for the moment the particular challenges of having, say, 5 parties to a coalition government. There's so many places where we could look to where, in fact, there is a settled kind of relationship in terms of the democratic process between opposition parties and those who are strong enough to form a government. By virtue of the support that we get or the mandate that we get, parties we can change from a 4-party, conceivably even more than 5-party government. That brings its own dynamics. So if we were to start with the round table, how does it move from the round table to buy-in at an executive level, given that that unique mix?
Well, in part, we have to let the round table work its way through that very difficult question.
Well, I'm maybe thinking about how it actually was transposed in Scotland.
Right.
How did we
Well,
arrive at a point?
Yes, I think the prize here is to have a conversation about what outcomes a society would like to have. And the impression we got from our conference here in Belfast and the leaflet which the pamphlet we got was a conversation focused on the future would be a conversation where you actually had some shared objectives wherever you came from, your age, where you were in the community, what part of the community you came from, because the ambitions for each of those parts of the community were roughly similar, about health, well-being, happiness, all those things together. So it held out the possibility of a conversation separate from where you might be currently. In order to do that, there had to be a trust in the system, of course. There had to be a greater degree of trust in the system and the process. But the way I would go is, if you're going to go somewhere else, I look at Canada, where they had a very large process of engagement, asking people what they thought, and from a whole range of different parts of the community. And what people's ambitions were for themselves, their children, their grandchildren, were virtually indistinguishable from wherever they were in the wealth group, wherever they were in rural or urban. They had broadly the same ambitions. So it was possible to bring together quite disparate, what appeared to be quite disparate groups into a conversation about the future. The key question then was, how did you measure progress? And that's where some of the hard questions were asked. So I would, in answer to your question, my hope would be, which is part of what the round table would do, is to get some enthusiasm from civil society to buy into this process, to get a whole range of intermediary organisations to have those conversations and to say this could be a process by which we could talk about our ambitions for a society. And then the technical side, how do you measure that, is probably something that your National Statistics Office and the civil service and you as politicians could also contribute to. But the key is that civil society conversation. And it comes back to the last question that Mr. Weir was asking, in that this is not what government can do for you, it's what each part of civil society, the market, the business sector, civil society, individuals and government can do together to build well-being too. So that would be the ambition.
Yes, in Scotland, it did grow from within the system. There was high-level support from the beginning of the process. So, in a sense,
Was that from the government side alone?
Yeah, well, I think both the government.
Was it from the entire Parliament, Scottish Parliament? Across the
it
Parliament?
was, I suppose, essentially the Scottish National Party.
It was within government, led by John Elvidge as a senior civil servant,
yeah.
leading a minority government who had no automatic control of the Parliament. I mean, I think that's where it came from, frankly. It had no overall control as a minority government.
And just taking Scotland as as a region that most of us have some familiarity with, how long did the process take?
Well, I think it's still ongoing. What Sir John Elvidge was saying to us, who's now a Carnegie Fellow working with us, was that it was fairly quick to embed in government within the civil service because you had direct hierarchical control over that. It still wasn't perfect. It was imperfect, but it was fairly quick. It was very slow to embed within the scrutiny functions of the Scottish Parliament, who still traditionally, for many years, scrutinised government activity on a sectoral basis and on inputs, not on an outcomes basis. And it only very slowly is rising in the political consciousness of civil society, because I don't think government was very confident about it, frankly. I think our own work and work of others has made them more confident. If you say this is world leading, it makes people say, to our surprise, as I said, it makes the government more confident about promoting it. So it's a journey. I think it's completely unfinished in Scotland, but they're quite a way down it. The summary would be deep commitment from the current government, of the SNP government, embedded broadly within the civil service, I think, starting to be a feature of the scrutiny functions of the Scottish Parliament, and now a conversation is starting in civil society about how valuable it is, and they can then feed back on those issues, and that's how it is.
It's interesting that, given our own form of government, you could conclude that this is quite a challenge. But equally, and I think what we've tended to do, we've come down on the view that it's also a compelling opportunity, because in a sense it may enable some of the levels of cooperation and thinking around themes that involve more than one department, and embedding a shared narrative of some kind within government, which is also shared by local government and wider civil society. There's a compelling, at least prospect and challenge there, I think, given the nature of our executive and parliament. You know, so.
Well, I mean, I have broadly the same perspective. I mean, just to give my view, I'm not indicating I'm speaking for all of the colleagues around the table, but I do think we map out for ourselves objectives and programmes for government that we already in the back of our minds we accept we're not going to achieve. We're going to do our best, and some of the criticism that we see in the media is, I think, Murdoch-type reporting, but it's not entirely wrong either about our inability just to kind of see the way to kind of match our aspirations to our actual performance. So for that reason, that's a very compelling argument for me to take a look at a different methodology, and I think that's how I intend to kind of approach this conversation.
I could just add that in terms of the kind of practicalities of things, I think that the timing timescales we're working to are quite fortunate in that the next programme for government will be 2016, which is a reasonable time away.
Yeah.
You know, so often you're working on these things and you've got to get it done in a few months' time, and that's not the case here. So I think it's an opportunity to embed it, and the prize, if you like, is a programme for government which is focused on wellbeing outcomes, and with a robust system of measurement in place that shows us moving away or towards or possibly away from them. So, and in order to assist with that happening in the round, there are conversations needed within the civil service, the senior civil service, and we've got senior civil servants involved in the round table. So we hope that there will be a kind of parallel conversation going on within officialdom, if you like. And in terms of the public engagement, well, then, you know, next year, depending on the Trust's view of things, there's an opportunity then to go out to some wider sort of public engagement on the issue.
Thank you. Thank you.
Adrian?
Thanks, Chair. Just as on your last point there, John, I want to raise about the membership of the round table. I don't see anybody there representing community, real community. You see the director of Community Foundation, NI, you know, somebody that's actually on the ground representing people's views from who's working day and daily for the well-being of their community. And we see that all over the place in different estates, and getting very little recognition for doing it as well. So, and there's nobody there representing older people either. So what can you do to try and widen the net a wee bit to include those people? Because I think unless you have the buy-in from that sort of community, you're going to go nowhere with this year.
I think we'll take that on board, absolutely. We would like, we have this ambition for it to be a widely and inclusive process, but not too large that it becomes unsustainable. So we'll definitely take that comment.
This year seems to be all academics and executives.
Well, I hope it's not all academics.
Well, what I'm looking at here is academics and executives, party executives. So, you know, we need some world-class people in here to get the real feel of the health and well-being of people.
Yeah, thank you.
Because I think it could end up a case of another high-powered Quango saying this is what we have to do to people who had no involvement in setting up the start office.
It's a very valid critique.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, I was at an interesting conversation. One of the points that Adrian has just made about even how you engage what classes is civil society. A lot of people tend to talk about that, but then is it, you know, we very often find it's usually the same people around the table, and I think that's quite a valid point. A few things that I would just like to to is even looking at some of the commentary around our theme departments in Scotland. Are they proving much better than some of our, unless it's falling into that silo mentality? I thought your point, Peter, about, was it 40% of spend was estimated to be preventable? I mean, that's a staggering figure if we were backing that up. And often in this place, and colleagues will hear this in many committees, we hear about early intervention, and we hear the difference it would make to physical health, to mental health, to education, to economic activity, to the criminal justice system. And we've been hearing this, you know, quite frankly, for years, but we've never managed to get from a high-level policy of saying this is what we would like to do, to actually putting it in the practice and saying, and not only realising the savings that you're talking about at 40%, but dramatically improving the outcomes. You know, and how do we take that from the conceptual, almost policy bit into practice?
I don't have a lot of detail, Martin, but there are two areas that have begun to show, or at least respond to these outcomes, both the health sector and the justice sector. Those are two case studies that I'd invite you to take a look at, where there's an attempt to integrate some of the thinking from the performance framework in the way they approach their delivery. But I don't know if you...
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that, as you say, any debate on preventative spend runs into the, well, where's the money going to come from? It's going to come from somebody else's budget. They're not in favour of it. So in favour of it in theory, but not in practice. I think that's utterly real politics. What this can do, and it's not a magic bullet, it can show, look at issues in the round. The preventative spend might come from one department and the benefits apply to another area of activity. With this kind of process, you can actually have that conversation. And the classic example is increased childcare. Increased childcare costs from a department often come from a welfare department. The benefits come from economic activity from women coming into the economy, building greater tax base to actually spend on other things. That's the kind of conversation you potentially could have for that kind of early intervention, or that kind of preventative spend. But the reality is, well, you'll know far better than I, in politics, this agenda is easy to say and difficult to deliver. The National Performance Framework hasn't made that conversation at the spend level any easier, but it's made it much easier in terms of the outcomes. We can actually explain why that intervention with those outcomes are important, because you don't have sectoral interests in departments saying, no, it costs and the benefits accrue to somebody else. So that's its benefit. That's the benefit integrating across departments. It works on the narrative, the public narrative that's been talked about before, because you can have a more open discussion about why you may have to spend more on a public service, get something into the future.
So you're basically you're at least now building up a more structured evidence base that this is why you have to do this, because this is the outcome that will produce. I mean, on that it's probably much harder, and going back to some of the conversation you had with Mitchell, it comes back to that's probably harder to deliver in our structure of government. Simply because the departments are held by different political parties, and several. The departments we've even just talked about, from the economy to justice to education. In our system, we've 3 different parties in those departments, and no one, you've no capacity at the top of the government to say, no, this is the direction of travel, this is what's going to happen. That's, our programme for government tends to be sort of very high level, and not in that sort of, you don't have it in all right, the Scottish currently have a single party in government, but they have an ability to say, the First Minister has control to say, make 2 departments come together, or 3 departments. Our structure, doesn't allow that.
Yes, but I think you are beginning to some learning around that challenge in the context of the delivering social change programs. I think that's, if we're talking about collaboration across departments, then it's probably about scaling up some of those approaches that have already been undertaken. And I think it's also noteworthy that the Minister sees this agenda very much in the context of his public sector reform agenda. It's not only about outcomes and policy, it's about doing things differently and more cleverly, if you like. And part of that is the preventative approach. And I think there are possibilities within that public sector reform programme to link to this agenda as well, and see the outworking of some of the outcomes approaches.
But in our case, the Minister's having some difficulty getting all his colleagues to engage in that reform process, and not, they're almost you're hitting a brick wall before you've really even got started.
It's often the case that we're victims of our own problems.
Part of that, and I agree with some of the points around targets. We sometimes do pick targets here that we know we're going to get lots of green boxes and meet them without really they're challenging. Probably even some of your thoughts around policy development compared, say, Northern Ireland, Scotland, other parts of the country, how that happens. Are we getting enough of that in? Like, is there enough of that going from manifestos into actual policy? Is that being developed strongly enough in other places? Sometimes here, with the advantage of, or the purpose of 5 parties in government, you can promise more in a manifesto and know that you don't actually have to deliver it, or that you have no real opportunity to deliver, certainly at all.
The conversation in terms of what Mr. Weir was asking about, is this a political-driven process? In Scotland it is, and we say that's a benefit from it. It's what a government is saying in consultation, which should happen more than it has done. What are the ambitions and outcomes for that society it wants to achieve? So the question then comes, well, having set those out, those ambitions, how do you deliver those if you have a fractured system of government or delivery, and how are you held to account? I keep on saying to people who speak to me about it, just because we're holding Scotland out doesn't say just go and take it over to lock, stock and barrel. It's worth having a look. They face similar, not the same, similar problems to those that you have. Executive power, they face those. Civil service, division, they face those too. A disengaged civil society, they face those too, to different extents. What it allowed to happen was this conversation about what kind of society would we like, but also the indicators about progress, and publish those and hold those to account. And the interesting thing was, which is building up in steam, is the agencies like yourself within the Parliament is more likely now to take account of these measurements and say, well, why is that? And this question of why is more of a conversation in Scotland. And the question of why, which is a Canadian expression, which says, just because the indicator is moving in a kind of negative direction, you don't automatically assume the government's to blame. You have a conversation about why that might be. And the classic example in Scotland was, we had an indicator that less people are visiting the countryside over a 2-year period. Well, we can't go to the minister and say, well, why? What are you doing about that? There's something that's happening in terms of people's choices about why that is happening. It opens up a question about transport, preferences, what young people may be doing. It opens up a much wider conversation. And I think we are glass half full. We think there's an optimistic future for both Scotland and Northern Ireland with this kind of process. The strapline for our report, which Peter and John wrote, was, a new conversation for new times. It brings people into a kind of future-focused conversation. It doesn't resolve everything, but it brings people to that point. It then allows the technicians who you'll hear from after us to say, what are the technical indicators that might actually say whether we're going to reach that or not, which is different from targeting. And those technical indicators are targets. So those technical indicators about where things are moving are quite complicated to interpret, and sometimes you've got to build new information. The one example of new information I would give that we are weak on in Scotland is we're weak on job quality. So we measure, are you in work? Are you working as much as you'd like to work? Is there an opportunity gap there? We are not measuring job quality. We know that job quality makes a huge difference to well-being of people, if somebody's in a job which they feel is worthwhile. So we need to find a measurement for job quality. And that would then be a driver for what kind of economy we're trying to create in Scotland into the future.
Yes, the one phrase that we have, we were cognizant of the challenges within the governmental system here, and we talked about, if you can't necessarily deconstruct the departments overnight for very sound reasons, but you can deconstruct departmentalism as an attitude or as a culture, and you can encourage some of the senior staff to go and work in other contexts, whether it's in another department or in another jurisdiction, just to begin to see things differently. Because it's not just about the different solutions, it's about interpreting and interpreting problems differently and coming up with a different sense of who needs to be involved in the conversation about resolving these issues, about early intervention. And it may not even be a conversation that's limited to the department. Something that is happening in Scotland is a shift towards a sense of government as an enabling government that is facilitating problem solving in partnership with local government and local partnerships as well. So there's all kinds of implications, and certainly there are challenges, but as I suggested, I think there are compelling reasons for looking at this as a way to overcome some of those challenges as well. Because the logic is compelling once you begin to take the outcomes approach and embed that narrative, that shared narrative, which also embeds, to a degree, political will for some of the collaboration that's maybe not happening at the moment.
Thank you, Rachel. Just before we conclude then, how encouraged have you been by the response from the Minister and the Department respectively in terms of the wellbeing conversations that have been ongoing in the past few months?
Well, as I say, firstly, I've been really, really encouraged both by yours and the Minister's presence at the conference. You jointly did the forward. There's been an engagement with the process, which I think is very good. And in terms of setting up the round table, we were just discussing that when I met a couple of weeks ago and then this morning. We've had overwhelming positive responses. We've had one person said they can't do it because of time. Everybody else we've invited has said yes, they can do. So all round, we think it's been given a very fair wind. I think and I'll ask Peter and John first to say something, but what we're keen on is to kind of draw out in more detail the kind of conversation we've been having today, the kind of concerns that people have, and to actually put it very much in the context of the political realities of Northern Ireland and the ambitions that people in Northern Ireland have, not just from government, but from a range of places. So I would say it's been given a very fair wind. And I should also say that I was with John Swinney last week, and he was very keen to be as helpful as possible to the Round Table, to host a meeting with the Round Table came to Scotland. So I think both sides, both Scotland and Northern Ireland, have got a lot to learn from each other in this process.
Yeah, well, I can't now much that said. I'm really pleased with the fair wind we've had and the response. It does seem to be, if you like, an idea whose time has come. It does seem to resonate with people, whether they're deeply embedded in policy or politics or work on the ground. It does seem to have something that has real meaning to people. And in terms of the Minister and this committee, we would be keen to maintain an ongoing engagement on the subject with him and with his officials, and I'm confident we've got that, and obviously with yourselves as the thing develops.
In terms of the next steps then, I mean, obviously you're going to meet 5 times, including a study trip to Scotland. before you conclude on your work. How will the committee be briefed as that process is ongoing, and what kind of input do you expect from us in terms of this process too?
Well, now that's a good question. I suppose I could tend to say, how would you like to be briefed? I mean, we are going to, and let's give you a sense of the outputs, if you like, of the roundtable. So we meet in March, and then again in May, and have a visit to Scotland. I think we'll start seeing some concrete things coming out of it after that, or during the summer. And our draft report we're going to be producing in sort of October time. So I think in terms of something worthwhile to report back, I think at the end of the summer, immediately at the start of the next session, might be an appropriate. I'm just slightly me thinking on my feet, Peter. I don't know whether that's...
Yes, well, one of the things is our intention is to ensure that the recommendations in the report are pitched in a way that meet some of the needs and interests both of the Minister in the context of the public sector reform. But also I think we will be trying to include recommendations that have a particular resonance for this committee around the scrutiny function and the budgetary function. And I think it would be possibly wise if we were at the interim point maybe to engage either with the chair or the members again to give you a sense of the direction of some of the recommendations or findings, so that when the final draft or the penultimate draft is prepared, that we're beginning to deliver something that you'll find useful. So that's something that we haven't mentioned, by the way, is that there will be an invitation to make submissions to the roundtable, which will be launched on a website right after the first meeting on the 24th of March.
And we'd be very happy to come back if you'd like to invite us back. We'd be delighted to be here. And I must say that your interest in this process and inviting us here has been immensely helpful in starting off, gives it a status which it wouldn't otherwise have had with a whole range of people that I have spoken to within Northern Ireland. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's been enormously helpful.
You're welcome. Mitchell, you want to?
Yeah, it's just an issue that that occurred to me earlier, and I didn't get the opportunity or take the opportunity just to. You see the approach of our minister in terms of the public sector reform agenda. Is that common to the process elsewhere?
I think public service reform is common to every government in Western Europe. We've got a meeting with the OECD at the end of March, which I can't go to, that coincides with our round table, to address this. It's the perfect storm happening. You know, the financial crisis, the demographic changes, all of those. So public service reform is on everybody's agenda. We've done a short paper, if you'd like to see this, where we went around some small jurisdictions. We went to Quebec and other places around Europe as well, saying, well, how are they managing this? And in summary, there's reform and there's the restructuring and so forth. But the rethinking agenda, that is a complete rethink about the purpose of government, which Peter was indicating about the enabling state, is in some of the ways the most radical thing that's going on. And that we're in the middle of a very complicated process that is within Western societies about trying to address this issue of, can we afford the post-1945 settlement in terms of the welfare state? And broadly, the conversation is going, well, we can afford to do that, but we're missing lots of other things. And it comes back to this agenda of bringing people back into the discussion about an outcome for society, and what can you do to actually contribute yourself, not just what you expect your government to do, but what you, your family and your community can do. And I think that's a modern conversation that most governments around Europe are having amongst themselves, and the OECD has this big program on this because its view is without trust from its citizens to government, this change can't happen. And there's been a fracturing of that trust since 2008 because of one thing citizens have demanded of their governments is economic stability, and that hasn't been delivered in the last few years. So it's a big challenge.
And specifically in the Scottish context, there has been the So the Christie report,
Yes.
which it does deal directly with public sector reform, and picks up on some of this context as well. So if you want to take a look at that.
Yeah, and I mean, public sector reform also, brings into focus the, I suppose, the interface between, say, staff side interests and, and what the government wished to do. Have the unions responded or submitted? I mean, I was glad to hear that that you are opening up for submissions. I expect that you're going to get some from the trade union side. Have they been involved in the Scottish?
In the studies for this? No. I mean, I don't think the unions are. I think there's a conversation to have. There'll be an open call for evidence to us. The producer interest in public sector reform, as you know, is very, very strong. And I think that's a very, very difficult process to engage.
I mean, I know before we even started, you say public sector reform, which I support. I think there is a need for it. But I can readily kind of anticipate how unions and some of the staff side kind of interests would see that as possibly or potentially threatening.
Doesn't that come back to Mr McAllister's point? Everybody's in favour of preventative spend apart
As long
from
as it's not in their house.
So I think that's the politics that you have to face every day, I would imagine. I don't think anything we're going to do is going to overcome that, but I think I come back to an optimistic narrative that says you can engage people about what future they would like. You then have to face some of those difficult challenges, which you would like that. What are you going to offer up to change?
Yeah.
I think that's the best that you can do in the short term to have that conversation.
Yeah.
The STUC have been part of the conversation. They've corresponded with the
Well, I think
Minister.
public sector reform in Scotland's gone along. I mean, there haven't been, the massive disruption, but there's been a large amount of conversations about that. But also there's a public conversation about whose interests, who is saying what in, and that is a very important one. Otherwise, you have a
No, but it'll be an important reference for ourselves going forward.
So
Just
we
to see
should
how they
take
did.
particular notice of that. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much. Very interesting.
Minister?
Just a quick shot, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Interesting subject, but one thing has been asked, and that is obviously well-being. It's a feeling that it generates as well on the ground. I'm just wondering if you'd comment on the last, the NISR report, the ONS report 2012-13. And we had the highest average ratings for life satisfaction, worthwhile, and happiness among the countries of the UK. Is that not what it's all about?
That was the ONS. Sorry, that was the ONS
Yeah.
report that Northern Ireland had that.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations, delighted.
Were you aware of that?
Well, I was aware of a whole range of, this is subjective well-being, a whole range of indicators about subjective well-being, and I think they are important, and if you start from that position, great, but you also have to look at objective well-being, about how you want your society to move. The difficulty with subjective well-being, and I'm not to take anything away from that, it depends on what your ambition is, and that's the objective. That's the problem with subjective well-being. It's nothing to take that away from that indicator. Let's talk about a good place to start, but let's not be complacent about that.
Yes. That might be, if I may be so bold, but it would be a question that Kevin could take on. He's a little bit more well acquainted with the statistical basis for those findings and just how reliable or meaningful those comparisons across the regions are. And that'll be an interesting question for Kevin.
Well, when I read that, I couldn't help but think, just remember Macmillan saying you've never had it so good, but people didn't quite agree with him, maybe.
I know.
It also says crisis. What crisis?
Events to avoid.
Events.
Big crisis to what crisis was actually called.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much. Wish you the best of luck with your work.
Thanks very much. Very good.
Okay, members, can I seek agreement that further briefing is scheduled on this topic towards the conclusion of the roundtable work? And given the cross-cutting nature of this subject, seek agreement that the attention of the other applicable Assembly committees is drawn to the Carnegie Trust report.
Agreed.
Okay, moving on to the next briefing from NISRA and Department of Finance and Personnel. Refer members the following documents. Correspondence from the Minister, pages 58 to 59 of your packs. DFP briefing paper, page 60 to 73, and a copy of UK National Wellbeing Measures NA data, February 2014, pages 74 through to 88 of your packs. Okay, can I welcome the officials to the table? Do you want to make some brief opening comments before we go to Q&A?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to update the committee on really where we've got to with measuring wellbeing in Northern Ireland. Myself and my colleague Michelle are representing NISRA, and as you're aware, I'm sure in that respect we can't really deal with any departmental policy issues, but I have two colleagues with me, Catherine and Rachel, who hopefully can deal with those. I'd like to just give you a brief overview of the paper that we did submit to the committee in terms of the genesis of the National Wellbeing Programme that we're involved with. ONS launched what they call the Measuring National Wellbeing Programme in November 2010, and it was initiated with something they called a national debate, and that ran for about 6 months through to April of the following year. And they took submissions from a very wide range of people. So they organised something like 175 events across the UK, including 2 in Northern Ireland. And these were public events with open invitations, and there were something over 7,000 people involved. ONS took, I think, about 34,000 responses through their consultation, as well as website and social media, etc. And that resulted in October of 2011, they published the first set of domains and indicators for consultation. There was again a consultation on that. Those were revised in July of the following year. And in November 2012, they published the first annual report entitled Life in the UK, which introduced this wonderful, what we call infographic, which I think you have amongst the papers, and I'll come back to. And I have to say, it works much better if you look at it online than it does on paper. That was updated in September 2013 and is due to be updated again in a few weeks' time before the end of March this year. I suppose really up until the Carnegie organised conference in the autumn of last year, I have to say there wasn't a great deal of traction on the issue of well-being in Northern Ireland. But at that time, Minister Hamilton asked NISRA if we could look at drawing together the Northern Ireland data equivalent to that published by ONS separately. And we did that, and that resulted in the report that we published just last week, and that hopefully you have seen a copy of. And what we did there was really we tried to draw together the data that had been published by the ONS, and we modified the ONS this wheel of measures, which I think is really just a way of drawing together the 10 domains and the 41 indicators that are part of the measurement of the National Wellbeing Programme. And we added an extra rim to the wheel so that you can easily compare UK figures with the Northern Ireland figures. But doing that piece of work also raised a number of other issues that when ONS revised the following consultation, they revised their domains and indicators, they changed one of the criteria, which had been that the indicators should be available for each country of the UK from essential to desirable. And I think the reason for that was they felt they might be missing out on some important indicators which were available at UK level but might not be available for England, Scotland or Wales. So when we were drawing this data together, that it highlighted some of those gaps where there appeared not to be directly comparable data available for Northern Ireland. So what we tried to do was to find perhaps not directly comparable, but what we call compatible data sources, and to fill as many of those gaps as we could. And on the wheel, we have indicated those areas where we're using compatible data by shading the data boxes, and then the more detailed infographics that go with it, we try to indicate where the areas of comparability and compatibility are. And that has also generated, so we've now published that, but it's also generated another piece of work, which is where there are these issues of direct comparability and where there are actually gaps where there appears to be no data available for Northern Ireland, what can we do about it? And we're already well down the road on that work. And we're negotiating with a number of departments that they should sponsor the collection of data, or in some cases it's a modification of data they're already collecting to produce it in the form that's directly comparable with the UK. And so, I mean, that's really where we're at the moment. We hope that this, what we have done, will feed into the Carnegie Roundtable process, and you know, is at least a start in terms of what has been agreed at UK level and widely consulted on, a set of measures that people see as important in terms of well-being.
Thanks for that, Kevin. I think it's quite encouraging, actually, that this work is taking place now and there's a focus on it within the department, rather than, for example, Carnegie carrying out the report and then the department responding to it, and then it puts things further down the line. Yeah. Just, I mean, taking the Scottish example there, I mean, if there's an outcome in terms of the Carnegie report and the Minister was minded to adopt, say, a Scottish approach and oversight, do you think you've been in a position to perhaps hit the ground running, that the data will be there for the majority of those sort of targets or areas of measurement in the Scottish case?
I think hopefully yes. Yeah, I think I mean there is an awful lot of data already available. So in this case, some of it is not just exactly comparable, but you know, we can address that. Is there any particular areas where there's a deficit, for example, economic data? I mean, that's the big area that at the macroeconomic level we do not have comparable data for that which has been chosen for the UK. You know, so we don't have, for example, a separate GDP measure for Northern Ireland. But NISR has been developing what is at the moment an experimental statistic that we refer to as the, and I'm just going to forget the name, the composite index.
We can understand that.
Yeah, so you know, that is a macroeconomic measure equivalent to GDP, and in fact it tracks GDP very well. You know, so there are opportunities for using other measures to reflect the economy in Northern Ireland beyond those which are essentially based on the national accounts process that ONS are responsible for.
Has there been much engagement with other departments? I'm thinking in terms of local government under DOE. Obviously, they have the power in terms of community plan within the new councils. And you know, if we're progressing the area of well-being, it would make sense that the central government and local government they're dovetailing in terms of this well-being agenda over the next number of years.
Catherine, is that something you would?
In terms of the public sector reform, clearly the Minister's view on that is that it is to cover the wider public sector and not just strictly the central NICS departments. And in that context, we will be and are liaison with local government colleagues and are aware of their initiative in terms of their local government mandate and community planning and well-being, which they're taking forward under their reform programme. So we would be looking to liaise with them and learn from having that and how we can incorporate that within our own reform programme.
Has there been any resistance in terms of other departments to looking into this area, or because obviously it will involve a degree of change?
In terms of the well-being measures, well, we're currently obviously just developing the reform programme, and the Minister is in process of bilateral meetings across his executive colleagues. He's obviously clearly very supportive and focused on the well-being area, sees it as a very useful supplementary measure in terms of how well government are performing and how that's being perceived by the public. He's asked PSRD to identify, as we develop the reform programme, to try and identify opportunities to embed the wellbeing measures in any of the programmes. We are already engaged with several departments. DHSPS have actually approached us recently. They're about to embark on a major preventative programme, and they have been looking to PSRD to see how we can liaise with them to develop a programme of measures and monitoring that will allow them to see how the outcomes of that programme, are successful or otherwise, and how that can inform things. So I think even within each of the department areas that are already identifying reform, wellbeing measures are there, albeit that it's becoming more recognisable now, but it's always been something that's been underlying some of these reform programmes. It's just trying to identify how well we can measure those and sort of push them up the sort of agenda and radar of people to understand, as some of the previous discussions have been, how this is an indicator of how well we're doing, or how we need to change, or how we need to adapt policies to meet what the demands of the people are. So I think it's understanding what people want to, in terms of their well-being and how they see that as success, and how government can then sort of adapt their policies to address those.
Maybe I could just comment in terms of filling gaps and moving from compatible to directly comparable. We've had very positive response, I think, from other departments. There are issues. For historical reasons, people have ended up measuring things in the way they measure them, and it might be slightly different from how they're measured throughout the rest of the UK. And you then face the difficulty of disrupting a long time series by changing your measurement. But I think we've managed to come up with innovative solutions that allow us to do both, to maintain the time series and to add in a new measure that's directly comparable. But it's been positive, I think.
And have any of you been on any of the junkets to Denmark or Scotland?
Unfortunately not.
On the interest of research.
Yes. Has there been any engagement with Scottish Government officials or any other countries in terms of moving this forward within the department?
Well, on the ONS, on the UK Measuring National Wellbeing Programme, there are a number of groups who inform that, the debate and the selection of the indicators and so on. And myself, I sit on one of the groups, Kevin sits on another, and our Chief Executive is on the overall advisory forum. So we're actually due to meet tomorrow with the Cross UK steering group that I meet on, and the officials from the Scottish Executive who do their national performance framework are in that. So yes, we do have the links through the UK programme.
Do you see wellbeing being one of the main issues or main priorities for the department over the next year?
Probably the policy.
I think looking to the measure in terms of and focus on outcomes as opposed to outputs, it'll be important in terms of the reform agenda, and certainly wellbeing seems to be at the fore. Looking at models, for example, Minister has tasked PSRD with looking at alternative models delivery, including things like social impact bonds, payment by results, which are both models of service delivery which are very much outcomes focused, and I think the measure will be important there in terms of being able to measure outcomes and its contracts and so on, but it's early days in terms of where we are with those, but that's something that will feature, I'm sure, on the reform programme.
In addition to that, as well as looking across departments, PSRD are currently developing a public engagement programme for the Minister, which is likely to commence around June this year. And that public engagement process will be, it's obviously a two-way thing, where we're going to be outlining the proposed approach to reform and what that means, why we're doing it, or why the Minister feels it needs to be in focus. But equally, we're looking at understand the public in terms of what their understanding of reform is, what they see as a need for change, and what they see as measures of success, which would very much include the wellbeing measures that we are seeing now, and we would be trying to build it in. The Minister's very keen that that is addressed within the public engagement process, and that process is likely to run from June through October, which will coordinate well, I think, with the round table process that Carnegie are taking forward, and that we would be monitoring very much the outputs and recommendations of that and marrying that up with what we're seeing in the public engagement.
Just in terms of that process, will the department be setting out a broad vision? Because at this moment in time, there doesn't seem to be much meat in the bones in terms of what's going to be the Minister's vision. Will he be setting out his vision before he goes out to a public consultation, or what?
Yeah, well, he's obviously developing that, and he is keen to get in the various ministerial colleagues, which is, he's trying to gather through the bilaterals at the moment. Because in addition to the public engagement process, he is keen to work with OECD in terms of looking at where are the potential areas for reform and the key areas that we should be focusing in across Northern Ireland. And he is asking his ministerial colleagues to put forward potential areas for review within their own departments or their own functional remit that could be included in that review. So that will create the vision. There's a lot of areas that are within the control of DFP, or that they would be taking the lead on, but there are other significant areas outside of that that we would very much want included in the ongoing vision for Northern Ireland.
Okay. Adrian?
Thanks, Chair. Catherine, just what you said there earlier on, will you describe the department's approach then as a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down, as I think the Carnegie Institute is doing?
I think in terms of developing the approach, we're very aware of the need to involve the staff, the people who will be delivering this as well. So the engagement process that we're putting together at the moment is sort of two key strands to that. There is the public side, but there's also the engagement with the staff in the departments and how they see and how they can be involved in reform. And one of the initial things we're doing is actually develop some form of scheme similar to how Carnegie outlined their submission to the round table, that we would be looking for submissions from staff in terms of their ideas on how we can reform or what should be changed or how we can change, and that will be hopefully developed over the next number of months.
And what about the communities?
The community involvement, certainly, and the public engagement would be very much involving the community voluntary sectors, as well as community representation through the likes of CAB or NICVA, the various representative organisations out there, some of whom we've already been.
Sure.
Okay, members, any other questions? No? Okay, you're getting off lightly today. All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Okay, members, can I seek agreement to receive an update briefing from MISRA on the further development of the local statistical data when available? Moving on to the next session then, can I refer members of the following documents: the previous Assembly research paper on NICS Human Resources Shared Services, pages 19 to 122, and DFP response to the research paper, page 123 through to 131 of your packs. Can I remind members that the Assembly research paper of today's pack was considered last May, and DFP subsequently provided the response before you. The research examined the performance of the EHR programme, particularly its key shared service deliverable, HR Connect. The key finding was that the overall picture of the HR programme's performance remained unclear due to the absence of clear baseline positions and the difficulty in establishing whether projected benefits have been realised. This highlights the need for a more rigorous and consistent approach to measuring performance, which is clear for external scrutiny. Can I welcome the officials to the committee then? Paul Wickens, Chief Executive of Enterprise Shared Services, and Colin Doran, Director of HR Shared Services, also within Enterprise Shared Services. Perhaps do you want to start by speaking briefly to the response you provided to the Assembly research paper, and also to explain what lessons have been learned in projecting and reporting benefits from shared services and how these are now being put into practice?
Okay, just make a short opening statement first and then perhaps pick that up. And thank you for the opportunity to come along this morning. HR Connect was the main deliverable from what was known as the EHR programme commissioned by DFP to replace a life-expiring payroll system and ageing non-integrated HR systems. From contract signature to programme completion in late 2011 was less than 6 years, but it concluded with all the intended services going into live operation. It's probably worth recalling that the previous effort to replace the payroll system alone, a much less ambitious objective, was cancelled after about 10 years with no result. Having personally led the final phase of implementation, I'm aware that the programme was not without its challenges, and with the benefit of hindsight, of course, there will be lessons for the department, including some of those highlighted in this report. For example, establishing better baselines or benchmarks to support both making decisions on investing in new solutions and in managing and improving them afterwards. But it's also worth stressing that the EHR programme, by any objective standard, has been successful. Against a background of seemingly endless reports of GB government projects cancelled, delayed or over budget, EHR is now a significant success story for the Northern Ireland public sector. That's not merely my opinion. It's underlined by the independent and rigorous Gateway 5 review, and it's also the view expressed by delegations from GB and Ireland who have come to Belfast seeking to share our experience, including HMRC and the Department for International Development in Whitehall, and more recently the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform in Dublin. So we would accept the points made in the report. Our response back has been, in some of the areas in terms of baselines, benefits, definition, probably could have done better. I'm quite happy to be probed on some of those points.
That's the increase of 3.8% and the overall cost for HRC remained within the tolerance of the business case. How was the additional 17 million in spend funded, and why was that not communicated to the committee at the time? And this is in reference to the table at page 125 of members' packs.
The original OBC was, I think, 328 million over 10 years, and by the time that got to full business case, looking at affordability and value for money, that increased to 465 million over 15 years. We're now looking at a projected cost, I think the last time we reviewed the business case, of 483 million. I think that's only about 3-4% over the figure, if I've done my sums correctly on that one. We're allowed up to 10% tolerance under DFP supply guidelines before we'd need to take any, if you like, extraordinary action on that basis. So we're actually significantly within the tolerance levels allowed on that one. Within that as well, the actual contract costs reduced from 185 million to 177 million. That they came about as a result of a couple of major contractual renegotiations prior to the full going live of the system.
So you're saying it's within the tolerance levels, so
we believe it is, yes.
Is that acceptable, or?
Well, I think to get, I mean, any project you're going to have an estimate for, which is effectively what it is, and to get within 10% of an estimate is fairly good. To get it within 5% of it, I would say, is extremely good, and we're within the 5% at this point. We will be reviewing the full business case again this year. It's an ongoing thing you do every couple of years. So, I mean, these figures are now a couple of years out of date. It will be interesting to see what comes up when we review it again, and I think the committee will need to be apprised of that when we come to that point as well.
What kind of factors result in the cost going up, even if it does pay 4 or 5%?
I think if you break them down into constituent parts, the cost of the actual contract that we have with our private sector partner has stayed absolutely stable. I mean, we manage that rigorously. Yeah. And where SLAs aren't met, we actually take abatements off them as well, although a very small amount, and I'm sure you might want to come back and ask us about that. So the contracted external costs have not changed at all. They've actually gone down from the original estimate. Where costs can rise is where on the retained side of departmental HR, there could be some variation in the way models are being implemented, and that's something we're going to be pushing out over the next year. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a few moments as well. But that's probably where the biggest change could be arising. And what we need to do is establish evidence to really understand where that is happening. Is there consistency? Is there inconsistency across departments in terms of the retained HR models? Have they got more or less people than they were obliged to have, I feel like, at the very start of the programme? And I'm sure there are some changes that have occurred over the years in that.
Adrian?
Thanks, Chair. Well, you said you're on 10% off the target. How do you benchmark that, or is it just benchmarked off the target?
Well, in terms of the overall target, we measure that purely against the target, but I mean, benchmarking is an interesting one in its own right, because I'll go into something I was going to go into later. We've recently established a programme called ESS 2020. I think I've talked to the committee a little bit about that before, which is if you like, the strategic direction we're going in terms of our shared services. And so ESS, Enterprise Shared Services 2020. Within that stage one, we've actually kicked off. In fact, Colin has got responsibility for that, and we've got a grade 6 starting in the next couple of weeks. I'm working to Colin to head up stage one, and there's three elements to stage one. There's benchmarking, so we'll talk a bit about that. There's improving the service, and there's improving the customer experience. So there's three distinct elements to that. In terms of benchmarking, we've done a significant amount of work trying to establish what are we going to measure, then looking at how are we going to measure that. And certainly off the back of a recent PAC on value for money for Account and I, and we know the difficulties there are, particularly on the cost side. So we're going to be very careful how we measure and benchmark across all of our services. We want a more robust and more consistent approach to benchmarking. We believe we've now got a platform in place to do that. We believe we'll probably bring an outside organisation in who are expert, who've got a big database of organisations that we can benchmark against, and then try to work out within that what are the apples and apples comparisons, which is where the real difficulties are. So business case, that's an easier one to do because it is against the cost as defined. There are many other aspects. How do we measure in terms of cost of HR per employee, things like that we need to have an external comparator to
I think that's one of the things that this project anyway was there nothing to benchmark off and nothing to sort of compare like with as well. But yeah, hopefully we'll hear from you in the future on that.
It also has to be remembered, of course, that prior to the implementation of HR Connect and the EHR programme, the HR functions were being carried out across the various departments, and there would not have been a consistent model or indeed consistent application of policy, etc. So it would have been difficult to set benchmarks at the outset of the programme, whilst it will become easier now if we can identify the right benchmarks to set.
Yeah.
Sure. Just on page 125 rather, you also refer to a further review of costs against the full business case, and that's due to be completed during the current financial year. What has that found, if it has found at this stage, and could we get details of that to the committee?
Well, that work to review the business, to review the full business case hasn't actually taken place yet. It's something that I have on my agenda to undertake in the coming months, and we will of course keep the committee up to date with the outcome of that work.
Just that way it says the current financial year, so it should not be completed by the end of this month, no?
I think it's unlikely that it will be completed by the end of this month, but it's certainly a priority to get it completed as soon as we can into the new financial year.
Roughly before the summer? Or?
I would hope to undertake it. As Paul has said, we're bringing someone in to lead up the ESS 2020 programme, and I would expect that person could do some work on this to review the existing HR Connect business case, yes.
In relation then to the areas of customer dissatisfaction reported in 2010 and 11, what were the results of the 2012-13 survey, and what specific improvement measures are included in the service improvement plan?
I think in terms of the way we've been measuring customer satisfaction, I think has proven to be somewhat unsatisfactory. We've had staff surveys done in the past that have then alluded to some of the results that have given us some very low scores on shared services, particularly on HR Connect. We've driven that more into a specific customer satisfaction survey. We've then driven that even further. We're again launching under ESS 2020, the third strand that I mentioned in stage 1 is to look at how we manage and measure customer experience. So if I give you a real example of that, for IT Assist, on a monthly basis now for the last 2 or 3 years, we send out an email to a sample of people who have actually used the service in the last month, and we ask them their opinion, just a few short questions. What the other surveys tended to do was a sort of mail shot to everybody, asking a fairly generic set of questions, and a lot of anecdotes were coming through. It wasn't solid enough evidence. So we've now got a survey developed, defined. We've worked with NISR on it to allow us to get a statistically relevant sample each month for all of our services. So if I'm a user of HR Connect, I may get an email this month saying, what have you used and what was your experience of using it? That's going to allow us to measure it on a much tighter basis. So we've recognised that we haven't measured it terribly well. And we need to do better on that one. But we have nevertheless worked on the key areas where we have been getting focus groups, staff groups, areas, complaints working on it as well.
Yeah, and I suppose from a HR Connect perspective, it will give us a much richer sense of what customer satisfaction levels are, because we will be asking specific service users of HR Connect within that month of elements of the service that they have actually used. That will allow us to build up both trend information in terms of general customer satisfaction rates, but will also helpfully allow us to identify areas where we really need to focus in improving customer satisfaction. Additionally, as part of the review of the SLAs for HR Connect, which we can touch on later, we have also introduced some customer satisfaction measures on which we will hold the contractor accountable on. Those weren't in the original set of metrics for SLAs, but they're going to now be included. So again, we are working on this on a number of fronts, and we're keen as part of ESS 2020 to improve the customer experience, not only for HR Connect, but for all of ESS services.
Can I maybe just add one more bit? Because if you like, an actual score on customer satisfaction tells you something, which is useful in itself. What is more useful is then to say, what are you going to do about it? And driving into the areas that we've identified, there have been 4 main areas where we've worked on over the last year. So first one is performance management, and this has been very much to feed into the new people strategy, and I'm not sure that the committee has been fully briefed on the new people strategy coming out of CHR on that one as well. But if you look at how we're going to engage with our staff, there are certain things we perhaps need to do a little bit better. So one is the performance management aspect. How do you do performance management online? We've worked a lot at streamlining the process, the screens, the instructions, the support that's available around that. We're now working hard, if you like, at a corporate DFP level to see how can we ensure that people are actually using the system, because now we've got one good single version of the truth in terms of information. We know that not enough people are actually putting performance reviews onto the system at the end of the year or mid-year. So there's a major drive at the moment through the people strategy to improve that. So performance management. Second one, one we've probably joked a little bit with you before on, was how to record leave and absence. If you remember the infamous how do you book a half day's leave in HR Connect, and us getting the award for the sort of plain English campaign on that one, it perhaps wasn't the best crafted piece of advice in the world. We've worked a lot on that one as well to make it simpler to actually use that aspect of the system. So we've listened to what our users have told us on that one. We've developed a new portal, so effectively a new front end, a new web-based front end that allows people to access things like the employee handbook online without actually having to log into the system itself. But you can then log directly into HR Connect, the self-service part of that, from that portal. That's been very, very well received because people can do searches, they can look at the recent news, they can look at job opportunities through that. So that's been a major piece of work that's received some very, very good plaudits. And the fourth one is in terms of the shared service centre. So if you like, the part of it that's been outsourced, the customer service aspects of that, we've worked very, very hard with Fujitsu and Capita to make sure they're doing the right things in terms of staff awareness, training, support, customer care, call handling, all of those things. And we believe we've seen a good improvement in that. And that's one of the good tests of that, is the number of complaints has been going down across those areas. So by focusing on the areas that people tell us about, we actually can make a difference and then listen and apply those changes going forwards.
And we have run a series of very constructive workshops across all departments with staff, both in ordinary offices, but also with departmental HR colleagues. And that has provided us with a source of information which we have now developed into a service improvement plan. So there will be a number of further improvements that will be taken forward as part of that service improvement plan over the coming year. And just to elaborate on some of the things that Paul has said, the half days leave, which I know was butt of some jokes, but that we advertised that on the portal and also as part of the new bulletin, which is produced by Corporate HR, Express HR, and the new revised advice on booking a half day's annual leave was very well received, and the upgrade to the actual technical infrastructure and the portal has also allowed additional functionality for users who can add favourites to their homepage so that they can more easily access the functions that they do most often, like booking leave, recording absence, etc.
Okay. Members, any questions? I'll have enough.
Yeah. Okay. Ecstatic.
Okay,
there was an issue at the start of this project about the copyright of the software. Has that been addressed?
I believe we own the rights to the IPR of the bits that we've changed. We've bought an off-the-shelf system. It's an Oracle-based system, and we've then customised it fairly heavily. So where we've customised it, the processes and the changes, we own the IPR.
We own it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Colin, Paul, thank you both very much again.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, members, can I seek agreement that, given the interest of the Audit Office in shared services, the papers from this session are copied to PAC and the Audit Office for information?
Yep.
Agreed. Jane, correspondence?
Okay, Chair. I'll just pick out the items of correspondence that require committee decisions. So at page 134 of the main pack, there's the regular update from DFP on outstanding post-project evaluations across all departments, which is a small increase from 76 to 78. There's just one in relation to DFP as a department, but the committee copies these out to the other statutory committees and PAC for scrutiny at a departmental level if members are content. Just to copy that report out.
Yeah.
Then at page 153, there's members considered this correspondence at a previous meeting. It's from NIPSA in relation to the NICS Civil Service Compensation Scheme. A briefing from NIPSA has been scheduled in the work programme for the 19th of March, but NIPSA has raised concerns around the consultation undertaken. That DFP is laying a report on the regulations today, a report on the consultation in line with requirements under the Superannuation Act, which this committee scrutinised last year. So the report is provided at page 3 of table papers, just for noting in the meantime. Then, Chair, at page 188, it's just a programme for the visit by the Economy Committee from the Jordanian Parliament. So some members have agreed to attend that lunch at 12:30 in the members' dining room. And then finally, there's correspondence and table papers from highlighting a complaint by I think it's a farming business against Ulster Bank, which has been considered by the Financial Complaints Ombudsman. There's a draft response at page 19 of table papers, which is in line with the previous responses to individual cases of complaints against banks. Chair, if members are content with the draft.
Yep. I'm out in the chair's name anyway, so we don't care.
How many complaints have we got about Ulster Bank now?
Several, Chair. And I think it comes up under work programme, Chair. Yeah. There is a session with the ETI committee coming up on the 10th of April.
Okay. Right. Okay, can I refer members to draft work programme at pages 194 to 196 of your packs. I can also say DFP is advising this morning that the EU funding session, which is rescheduled for next week, will need to be put back another week because the paper is not ready for issue. In place of the EU session, DFP is proposing to move the rates and LPS sessions from the 19th of March into next week, bringing that forward. So the committee could leave it to the clerk to negotiate with DFP officials, but members may still wish to put down another marker that they're not content with the very short notice being given, especially given the previous assurance from officials responsible for EU matters.
I want to be on the left-hand committee.
Good balance there.
Any views, members? No.
Jimmy.
I think it goes past 12 o'clock, everybody just switches. Also, can advise members that the Committee for Enterprise, Trade and Investment will be meeting with reps from the Ulster Bank and the Irish Bank Officers Association on Thursday the 10th of April. Members of this committee will be invited to these sessions. Up to 4 members will be manageable in terms of the seating arrangements, we've been informed, and an invite can be found at page 22 of your table of papers. If any members want to attend that meeting, indicate now. 22nd.
Ring around anyway.
Yeah, we'll do a ring around close to the time. Okay, in preparation for committee scrutiny of budget 2015-16, can I seek agreement with the Commission to research papers? Firstly, a paper examining the European Investment Bank as a source of finance for capital projects, comparing it to other sources and how other jurisdictions avail of it. And secondly, a paper on preventative spending, particularly in light of the Scottish Government placing a focus on budgeting for prevention. Members agreed with that? Members content the work programmes updated, reflecting agreements made today? Any other business? No. Provides members next meeting next Wednesday at 10 AM in room 30.